Hi, welcome back to the channel. My name is Dr. Claire Killingback and I'm a senior lecturer in physiotherapy. And in this video, I'm going to talk through quantitative research design, specifically looking at observational and descriptive studies. Now, that's in contrast to experimental study designs, which is more around randomized control trial. So, an observational or descriptive study is a type of study that's attempting to describe, as you would guess by the name, the characteristics of a population or a phenomenon being studied. And so, it's a study in which there is no intervention being made. And it's one of the best methods for determining the incidence and the natural history of a condition. When we talk about incidence, we're really talking about that rate of occurrence of something. So these are the main types of observational or descriptive studies. So I'm going to talk through each one of these just as a really general overview and then give you an example to try and explain what we mean by these different types of design. So, first up is case study. And so, a case study is an in depth examination of a single case or an event, a case report, or a small group. But either way, it's a quantitative design that has a really, really small participant sample size. It's commonly used in fields of medicine, psychology, and sociology. And the advantage of it means you can get really detailed information. The disadvantage is that it's actually much harder to generalize to wider populations from it. And that's because it tends to focus on a new or rare event or condition, unusual presentations, new or unique treatments, or an unexpected response to treatment. So let's have a look at an example. So this example actually comes from quite a long time ago, and it's about someone called Phineas Gage. So he was a railway worker who worked in America, and he was responsible for clearing away the rocks in order for the railway track to be laid. So for the bigger rocks, he would drill a hole in, and he would use an iron rod to tamp down the explosives into the middle before lighting a fuse. But what happened to him on the 13th of September, 1848, this kind of relatively simple procedure that he'd been doing for a long time actually took a bad turn in that apparently as he scraped his rod down the side of the rock, it created a spark and that set off the gunpowder early. And it sent this iron rod, which is about a meter long and 3 centimeters in diameter, it sent it up through his skull and out the top of his head, apparently landing some 30 meters away from him. So he was unconscious, as you would expect, for a few moments. But actually, then he got up and got on his ox cart and rode back into town. Now, the good news is, under the care of one of the local doctors, he carried on living for another 12 years. But this momentary lapse of concentration led to him becoming one of the most fascinating case studies ever in history. And that's because it taught us so much about brain science that we didn't know at the time. And the reason is he survived, but he was a changed man because of it. So reportedly now he was unreliable, he was partial to swearing, he would often make inappropriate remarks. And so that's what we would now classically describe as someone who's disinhibited, which is what can happen after someone gets damage to the frontal lobes of their brains. So for specialists, this was a staggering revelation because it was the first time that there was evidence that damage to the brain could affect our personality or behavior. So, although this was only one person, a single case study, the amount of learning from it was huge. Now, we do still use case studies as part of quantitative research. This is nowhere near as dramatic, but it still has a role to play in developing our knowledge. So, this is a case study example, and it was specifically around independent prescribers when physiotherapists were able to take on that role. And this is a case study, and I've just kind of outlined the bit at the bottom, and it says it outlines the assessment and treatment of a patient with lower back pain and neuropathic leg pain. And it involves all the details around the independent prescribing and the process that that physiotherapist went through in that situation. And that was important because it was a relatively new thing that physiotherapists were able to independently prescribe a number of years ago. So that's a case study as a quantitative example. The next three study designs I'm going to talk through, time is a really important consideration. And so, actually, I think seeing this table will help you get your head around some of those. So, if we're talking about a cross sectional study, that's really to do with the present. Case control studies tend to be looking backwards to the past, so retrospective. And then prospective cohort studies tend to be looking forward to the future, so they're prospective or longitudinal. So, kind of try and hold that table in your head as we're thinking about these next three designs. So, cross sectional study, now these really give you a snapshot of an outcome of interest depending on what you're looking at. It analyzes data from a population or a representative sample at a very specific point in time. And it's primarily used to determine prevalence. And so, prevalence kind of equals the number of cases in a population at a given time point. So, the way that I think about cross sectional study designs, it's kind of like I take a photograph of that moment in time of what is happening with that particular population. So let's have a look at an example. So this it comes from a study where it was looking at the prevalence of smartphone use and smartphone addiction among physiotherapy students. So you can see from this graph, it's looking at the duration of smartphone use in a typical day. So n equals 220. So n stands for the sample size. So they had 220 participants in this study. And so if you look at that, actually 30% of the students that they sampled were spending more than 5 or 6 hours a day on their phone. So it's actually quite a large amount of time, isn't it? And then in this next graph, this is looking at the frequency of smartphone use. So how many times are they picking up their phone to look at it in a typical day? And actually, it's almost 30% are looking at it 21 to 50 times a day. But then you've got 14% of this higher end of the spectrum looking at it at more than 100 times a day. So if you think about that, if that's a typical smartphone use for a physiotherapist in this population, and you do have to look at the population to know whether it's generalizable it's not necessarily generalizable to all physio students. But if you think about a physio student on placement, then if you're typically used to spending 6 hours a day on your smartphone, picking it up more than 100 times a day, and then you're on placement, you can't do that in a clinical environment because you're there to treat patients. And so I think it's important that we're aware of that so that we can be encouraging physio students on placement to, put your phone away, leave it in a locker. I just thought it was an interesting study, which is why I've included it as a cross-sectional study example. And then there are case control studies. So with case control, remember that table, that's about looking backwards. So it's going backwards retrospectively. And these use data already collected for other purposes. And then the cohort is followed up, kind of going backwards. And the subjects are defined as either cases or controls. And it tends to be looking at, or it can look at historical exposures, for example, can be compared. So historical exposures could be, lifestyle factors or occupation or those types of things. So let me give you an example. So this case control example, this was a case control study to investigate the relationship between levels of physical activity and osteoarthritis in the knee. So the reasoning of these researchers was that physical activity is recommended as an intervention for improving health. That's a good thing. But a potential concern with this recommendation for increased exercise is that some believe that increased levels of activity may actually lead to an increased incidence of osteoarthritis of the knee as a result of accelerated wear and tear of the major joints because of the increase in physical activity. So, investigate this, they had a hypothesis, and that was that the occurrence of knee osteoarthritis may be related to the duration of participation in some forms of sport and recreation, active recreation. So they did an extensive survey and they found people from a national survey who had knee osteoarthritis. And they then matched them to a control group, i.e., they were similar in other ways, but they just didn't have osteoarthritis in their knee. And then they asked both groups about their physical activity across their lives. And what they found was that there's little evidence to suggest that increasing physical activity over life leads to increased osteoarthritis in the knee. But if you had a previous knee injury, that was associated with increased risk of osteoarthritis. Now, most injuries can be caused through participation in physical activity. So you have to think about the type of activity you're doing and the chance of injury, as some of those activities can have a greater risk of injury. So that's an example of a case control. Number 4 is a cohort study. So this is a sample, it's first selected and then it's followed up prospectively. So also known as a longitudinal cohort study or a prospective study because it's following them up going forward through time. So one of the most common examples for this, or maybe not common is the right word, but that one of the longest running studies as a cohort study is from the 1946 March birth cohort study. And so they followed up 14,000 babies born in the same week of March from birth across England, Wales, and Scotland. And so there have now been something like 6,000 academic papers, and it is on this particular study. And so it just informs our knowledge of human development. So if you're interested in reading more, there's a really interesting book by Helen Pearson called The Life Project, and that looks at some of these cohort study participants. So I thought that was quite an interesting one to choose for you. So, in summary, there are really these four main types of observational and descriptive study: case studies, cross sectional, case control, and cohorts. Different researchers will refer to them in different ways. So, be aware that there is some nuance around this and it's not quite as clear cut as I've presented it. But just as an overview and an introduction, that will hopefully give you the basics so that when you're reading research papers, it will help you work out the design and what the researchers were doing. So, I hope that's helpful for you.